My guest this episode is a seasoned Middle East banker who runs his own boutique investment bank, Ithmar Invest. Fawaz Ghanem paints us a picture of the Jordanian economy, the investment landscape or lack thereof, and how we got here. What are some remaining safe zones in the COVID economy? And how did nearly all super rich Jordanians build their wealth? We also reminisce over New York City days, our fascination with US politics, and with Tony Robbins' life hacks. Enjoy. This episode is sponsored by Mlabbas, your print-on-demand t-shirt service, where you can now order dozens of other gifts and accessories online by visiting www.mlabbas.com. That's MLABBAS.com. Fawaz Ghanem, thanks for coming, Habibi. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me on your podcast, Imad, and it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thanks, Habibi. We're back on Zoom due to scheduling issues, and it's obviously safer.
Safer and easier.
Yeah, easier, definitely. Fawaz, we've known each other maybe 2 decades or something like that. We've overlapped in New York City. And you were knee-deep in investment banking. You were at UBS Warburg at the time.
I was.
And before that, you did your MBA at NYU, where I was doing my undergrad in finance. We kind of are, we have the same alma mater, I guess.
Absolutely. Great school.
Man. Yeah, excellent place. You spent about a couple of years with UBS in New York City.
Spent around 5 years with UBS. Started off as an associate right after my MBA from NYU in 1999. And I spent a few years going up the ranks, the mergers and acquisitions group there. And we covered mainly US companies across all sectors. But in the last 2 years of UBS, my main focus was really on healthcare.
Okay. Healthcare, was it pharmaceuticals or was it services or components?
You know, it's a wide-ranging sector, but I've done some work with pharma companies, with clinical research organizations, with pharmacy chains. It was really broad. Plus, it was one of the stronger groups that we had at UBS because it was headed by a very prominent investment banker called Benjamin Lorello, whom UBS had recruited in 2000 from a firm called DLJ. And DLJ at the time had the best healthcare group in the US. And he came in with his entire team to UBS. And I was lucky enough to have built good rapport with a couple of managing directors there who frequently asked for me to work on the mandates that they were working on. So it was definitely a very extensive experience, a lot of work, a lot of hours, a lot of all-nighters, as my wife Yasmin would tell you. And even on Sundays, we used to go for at least 8 to 10 hours.
Yeah.
So, and that's partially why I decided after a few years I spent there and having gotten married in the last 2 years I was there, I decided that maybe it's time to come back home and do what I love back in the region, being closer to family and, start our own family here. Yasmin didn't like it at the time. He still blames me for leaving New York, but I don't have any regrets.
Were you there during 9/11 or you had left just before?
No, I was there. I was there in 9/11. I was engaged to Yasmin at the time, and I was on the way to the office in a cab. I lived on the Upper East Side, and my offices were in Midtown. And the driver was telling me, "Did you hear about the plane that hit the World Trade Center?" And I said, "No." I was actually late for a meeting, so I was browsing through stuff. So I didn't make much of it. So when I arrived, people were like gathering in one of the managing director's offices who had a TV in his office. And then we watched the second plane hit.
Yeah.
And that's when, we realized that this is premeditated, and we got an announcement on all of our voicemails asking us to go home. So we went downstairs, and I remember it was like Judgment Day because all the cell phones didn't work. I had a couple of friends who worked in downtown. I couldn't check in on them. So I ended up walking from 48th Street to 96th Street where I lived.
Did UBS have an office downtown?
We didn't, but I've been to the World Trade Center a few times.
Yeah, me too, definitely. You know that I was actually there the night before with a friend of mine who was visiting.
You went to the windows on the world?
We were at the South Street Seaport for dinner. And then we walked all the way up to the World Trade Center Plaza with the 2 towers, the courtyard.
Yeah.
So my friend still till today, he's not from New York. His first and last time to New York City.
Oh
And
God.
the next day he was in a hotel in Midtown. He's like, dude, we were there at like 10 p.m. last night, and 11 hours
Like
later.
12 hours, huh? 12 hours before.
Yeah, man, it was nuts. Do you remember the smoke for a week? People can sometimes forget because it was only Manhattan,
More than a
maybe
week,
New Jersey.
Matt.
More than
I
a week.
remember
It
it
was
was like 2 weeks,
smoke.
3 weeks. I
Yeah,
remember from my apartment and even from my office, whenever we looked downtown, I mean, you couldn't see, like, no, it was all
yeah.
skyscrapers, but all you could see was a huge smoke, cloud of smoke.
God.
And it lasted for at least, if I recall correctly, at least a couple of weeks.
And I was on 13th Street near
Mm,
NYU campus. It was very
sure.
close. And they actually had tanks on 14th Street. And you're right, the cell phone stopped working. I think Verizon made, or whoever was in charge of those phone booths, the phone booths became free for a few days. The movie theaters were allowing people in just for free to watch movies. Like you said, it was like Hajj, like pilgrimage. People were crossing the bridges on foot.
Psychologically.
Like Brooklyn Bridge was packed with walkers just leaving on foot. It was, I remember.
But you know what was hard? The few days after that, when I went down close to where you lived, the amount of photos of missing people,
Oh wow,
um,
yeah,
it was heartbreaking to see the
yeah,
people running around, trying to find their loved ones, and
that's
all
true.
these photos
Yeah,
on the walls.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It was
Interesting times, Yani.
very, very interesting
Yeah,
times, and the world doesn't seem to stop having interesting times. I mean, right now it's end of 2020, still knee deep in Corona crisis mode in terms of
sure.
economy, in terms of death rate, infection rate. It's globally, except for China, everybody is suffering deeply. But I want to ask you, when you left New York and came to Jordan, where you grew up, how was your landing here in Amman, and what did you do in terms of investment and banking and finance?
Sure. I had lined up a job with an investment banking firm called Jordan Best. It was headed by Dr. Henry Azzam, who was a prominent economist in the Middle East. I joined them as head of corporate finance. It was a public shareholding company that was, had the full-fledged licenses for investment banking. It was an interesting period because my first adaptation had to be for me and my wife to adjust to living in Amman versus New York. So obviously that was the first shock that you take, because in New York we were two lovebirds, recently married, no social obligations. You didn't have to go to any weddings or engagements or give condolences to anyone, or we were like free. And we came back here. Obviously, there's all sorts of family pressures and social pressures. But on the professional front, I had to adapt because I hadn't used Arabic in my professional work for a long time. I left Jordan when I was 15, going to boarding school in England. So for a long time, I haven't used Arabic as my main language. Suddenly, you're responsible for a department that had to compile and issue bond prospectuses and share prospectuses and private placement memoranda, and oftentimes were investor presentations, doing it in Arabic, or you had to do presentations in Arabic. So the first 6 months, I had to do a lot of work on the language from a financial perspective. Um, Luckily, our work extended to providing our services to companies in the UAE sometimes and Qatar sometimes. So there was some travel that came with my new job, and then we got our first daughter like literally 9 months after we arrived here. So things began to settle down quite soon after we landed here. Jordan West, I stayed with them for 2 years, and then I left with the same team that was running Jordan West to start Amwal Invest, because there was a hostile takeover of Jordan West. And we started Amwal Invest, another public company that was literally 3 times the size of Jordan West. I was there as deputy CEO with Dr. Henry Azzam. I spent a year and a half. Our chairman at the time was Hamad Abu Ghazali, who was a very known businessman. He's the majority owner and chairman and CEO of Fresh Del Monte Produce, which is a New York Stock Exchange listed company. So it was a great experience at Amwal, but at some point in the late second half of 2006, I decided that I no longer want to work for anyone. I want to start my own firm, and I wanted to be my own boss. So I raised capital from friends and family. And I started Ithmar Invest, which is where I've been since 2007, since early 2007. Ithmar Invest is a boutique investment banking firm specializing only in the corporate finance line of services. As such, we don't have any brokerage activities or asset management activities or research. It's purely corporate finance and advisory. We do everything from valuing companies to advising on mergers and acquisitions, whether on the buy side or the sell side, taking companies public and listing their shares on the exchanges like IPOs, helping them in issuing bonds or sukuk or convertible securities, helping them build business plans and financial models. So that was kind of a very narrow and focused line of services. And we got the license here in Jordan from the Jordan Securities Commission. We managed a couple of years later to get it in Palestine from the Palestinian Capital Market Authority. Then we got a license in Qatar. And then we got a license in Saudi Arabia, where we have an office right now in Jeddah from the Capital Market Authority. So now we're working across those 4 geographies. And sometimes also we do work with Dubai-based or Abu Dhabi-based companies too. I have a great team with me, very strong technically. Our reputation locally, at least in Jordan, we've managed to win a couple of awards as the #1 investment banking firm. And we remain optimistic that our services will always be, at least in the medium term, will always be demanded by corporations, whether they're private or public.
Amazing. The early years of Ithmar, was it during the financial crisis?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually quite funny because when I started Ithmar in 2007, there was actually a bull market all over the Middle East, all over the world. There was plenty of money. People were interested in investing in public securities or in private companies. And then in 2008, we began to see a couple of hedge funds that, crashed and burned. And obviously, a few months later, we had the global financial crisis. That lasted a good 8 to 9 months and overlapped between the administrations of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. That had a huge impact on Jordan. It had a huge impact on investment banking in the Middle East. Many financial institutions were actually invested in those CDOs and mortgage-backed securities. Luckily, in Jordan, we have a very strong central bank, so the banks weren't exposed in that way. But like everywhere else, the market is based on sentiment, and the sentiment across the world and across the region was very negative. And that affected the stock market here, which meant that many companies' share prices declined heavily. And believe it or not, since 2008 until present date, we haven't had a single IPO in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan.
Wow.
Not a single company went public since 2008. So you're talking about a 12-year stretch. Usually financial cycles, stock market cycles, they usually come in between the 5 years, maybe they could last 7 to 8 years. In this case, we've managed to exceed everyone's expectations. And in a couple of months, we'll be rolling into our 13th year.
Damn. You probably really know the ins and outs of why. It's not just the effect of the crash 12 years ago. You probably wouldn't recommend IPOs on the stock exchange for most corporates, most private companies, correct? I mean...
Yeah, it's interesting you asked me that because a few months ago, we were mandated by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. They have a big operation here in Jordan, EBRD, and
Yes.
they signed the mandate agreement with us to assist them along with the Amman Stock Exchange and the Securities Depository Center and the Jordan Securities Commission to try to identify potential private companies that may want to list their shares on the Amman Stock Exchange. And we just wrapped up the mandate, and they were willing to give so many incentives for private companies, like waiving of listing fees, even like having EBRD potentially assisting in getting in investors for these IPOs. The end result, we weren't successful in convincing a single company to go public. And The reason for that, obviously, you can't blame the regulators. I mean, the regulators, at the end of the day, they can provide all sorts of incentives, but it's the companies themselves that have to make that decision to go public or not. Why didn't we manage to convince anyone? Well, several reasons. One, I've mentioned as well, the first point is we haven't had a single IPO for 12 years. No one can have any precedent transaction to look into seeing the advantages. It's been a very long time. The second one is the fact that the trading volumes on the Amman Stock Exchange are now between 3, 4, 5 million JDs a day, daily trading volume, which is a ridiculously low number when compared to any other stock market. So there's no liquidity. Third, banks aren't lending to investors right now to potentially invest in shares. And 5, the general economic situation due to COVID. People are losing their jobs. Unemployment rate, which was originally high at 18, 19%, has now hit 24, 25%. Liquidity, even though we have a strong banking sector, I think liquidity at the various banks, even the bigger ones like Bank Al Arabi, Bank Al Iskan, you saw that from their September 30th reviewed financials or the June 30th reviewed financials. A lot of them are taking major hits on non-performing loans. Part of it is because of COVID and the effects of COVID. The other part is probably due to the fact that there were some really bad apples in those portfolios, and it was about time. When something like that happens, usually the banks take something called the big bath behavior. So whatever you know is not working, but you're kind of delaying it, you kind of take it and put all the bad apples in one basket and try to move on. Those are some of the reasons, but we've obviously had persistent socio-economic challenges in Jordan before COVID. I mean, we have an economy here that is 60, 70% based on services. And then you have the lockdowns coming in. And when you have lockdowns and quarantines, people stay at home. When they stay at home, they can't go to work. When they can't go to work, they can't earn a living. And when they can't earn a living, they don't have the disposable income that they've had before. So economic activity comes to a halt. And Jordan has a very high percentage relatively in its workforce, which is in the informal sector, which means there's such informal sector, even if the government wants to assist it, it's not really kind of formalized, it's not within the books of the government to go and be able to assist it. Other than the fact that you have SMEs, which represent almost 40% of your GDP, that were barely making ends meet before that. So you look now at, travel agencies, smaller restaurants, you look at, the smaller workshops, the mom and pop stores. This is really what Jordan is known for. And if you have 52% almost of the workforce that works in such SMEs, obviously the problem is going to be way amplified. We have to give credit when credit is due. The government did make certain steps in March and April and May, whether it's by delaying the payments to the Social Security, whether in delaying the monthly installments on loans from businesses or from individuals with banks, and setting up a fund that gives loans at 2% interest rate. But, right pre-COVID, I think the government, I've once read something by Minister Mohammed Al-Assas, the government up till the end of 2019, they were kind of working on a recovery act because they know that the situation in Jordan hasn't been, ideal in the last few years or in the last decade for that matter. Over the past decade, we've had many external shocks that if you really aggregate all of them, they're probably worth around 44% of our GDP over that 10-year period. In terms of per capita income, for instance, in the last decade, I think we've lost almost 14% of our GDP per capita. So whatever you were earning in 2010 and earning 2020, you actually lost 14% of that. Yeah. And if you account for inflation and what happened, although inflation wasn't, very high for most of those years, that means that there's an erosion in purchasing power. You add to that the waves of refugees that we've had come in from Syria, which ballooned our population to almost 10.2 million people, and being promised and many countries pledging to give us monetary aid to handle those refugees. And I believe that a substantial percentage of such pledges did not come. You add to that the ISIS, Daesh, 2011 to 2015, the amount of money we had to spend on security on the borders. At some point, I remember I was worried, probably in 2015. I remember myself sitting at home here, and I had just read an article on how close these guys are on the Iraqi and Syrian border. They were literally an hour and a half away from my home and your home.
Yeah.
Wasn't easy. But I think the final thing I'd like to say is, we had Syria and Iraq shut down to trade. Egypt stopped supplying us with natural gas, which was a cheap source of gas after their so-called Arab Spring, which made us go back to heavy fuel purchasing. So all of these external shocks, not many countries can survive them. I disagree sometimes with some of my friends who try to blame the government or the decision makers here. This is a very difficult country to manage. This is not a country that has a steady stream of revenues coming in from natural gas or oil or minerals or anything else. We're living in a very bad and tough neighborhood, and we have our currency pegged to the US dollar, which doesn't allow us a lot of leeway in terms of using monetary policies to change things. But Allah يعينهم, يعني it's not the easiest country to manage for sure.
You've covered almost all the macro negative factors that are holding Jordan down. Iraq and Syria closing for trade is a huge hit, coupled with the tourism hit from the Daesh, Arab Spring, all that stuff was.
Yeah.
There hasn't been any real steady growth in tourism income that you can be confident of. And the government has done some great steps, like the Ryanair contract, which helped a lot in 2019, buoy some of the services industry in a big way. But that's obviously all gone this year.
On the tourism part, Imad, I mean, I agree with you. You know, we had most of the activities in tourism, you know, ceasing in 2020, like most other countries in the world. But I think it came especially at a very bad time for us because the sector had really just managed to gain momentum in the last couple of years. The tourism expenditures were actually grew by around 10% in 2019 compared to 2018. Tourism's share of the GDP had jumped from something like 9-10% to 12.5%.
Wow.
And obviously, this is a sector that has 42,000 people working directly in that sector, and along with 130,000 indirectly working in tourism. But the main part was this sector actually contributes a significant portion of our foreign currency reserves. In 2019, we had almost 4 billion JDs worth of tourism expenditures that were all in foreign currency. But I am optimistic that the second half of 2021, we will manage to see a recovery. Some countries will have that before others. In Jordan, I project that won't happen before the third quarter of 2021.
I mean, especially if we're talking about tourism dollars coming in, no matter how fast the vaccine is rolled out globally, the effects on Jordan, which is not Jordan is not Paris or Rome, where the tourism will switch back on immediately. It's not on the map in the same way. So it will take a few quarters. But I want to ask you about general recommendations to the Jordanian economy that are probably even without COVID, because I mean, for example, I'm invested in a small trading business and in a larger trading business. Now, the large trading businesses, like you said, some large companies, due to market share, they're able to withstand and survive and maybe even take more market share. But the middle of the road services and trading companies in Jordan, for example, one of my businesses, Mlabbas, we had to take a bet that things will come back next year. And we basically borrowed our losses this year through the COVID loan, the 2% COVID loan you mentioned that the government provided. Now we're looking at it and thinking, man, we're having some emotional thoughts about maybe we should have just folded back in April when we had the chance. Maybe, I don't know, somehow should have done something different because it's not coming back and we're reliant on tourism in a big way. So, and then I ask myself, you know what, we can survive. We can bridge another loan to maybe another 2 quarters and survive, and the business can survive. But I ask myself, do I want to dig a deeper hole? Do I want to continue with the losses without profit, only to go back to 2019 levels of prosperity, of sales, we're not even going to go back to 2019 levels next year, but let's say in 2 years. I'm honestly exhausted as a business owner with the Jordanian economy as a whole. Now I have to fight for 2 years without making any money, digging deeper holes and taking bigger risks to just go back to what we were in 2019. So are there any structural recommendations or hacks that come in mind Maybe it's deregulating a sector. Maybe it's crack down hardcore on certain corruption. Something that would apply even before Corona.
You have to remember, Imad, we are number one, or in the top five at least, in terms of the number of people in the workforce who work for the public sector. 45% to 50% of all working Jordanians work for governmental entities or quasi-governmental entities. Yeah. That, if you add to it the retirees, you have hundreds of thousands. Changing the culture and the way of doing business is going to be very hard. I mean, how many years have we been talking about in terms of having the one window investment office where an investor can come in and get all he or she needs to get done to set up shop in Jordan? That hasn't worked, with all due respect to all the people who are running the investment promotion commission right now here in Jordan. I am more of the belief, I'm more on the Republican side of things when it comes to fiscal matters here. You have a country that has 16% VAT or sales tax. We have a country that you technically buy a car for yourself and you buy another car for the government. We had electric cars introduced into the market a few years back. And instead of having those cars come in at very low customs, you had a government that actually increased it to 55% overnight, which, disincentivized people to buy it. Now, for a country that doesn't have any oil, you would think that they would be kind of steering people towards buying electric cars because our fuel bill would actually go down. But if you dig deep through why the government actually didn't do that, didn't encourage people to go down the route of buying electric cars, the government actually loses revenues if people start switching from normal diesel, petrol cars to electric cars. So they're not going to incentivize any of us to go down that route. So sometimes how the government is looking at it in terms of revenues and how the actual population is looking at it in terms of their own wallets and budgets, there are opposing sides to this equation. So you're not going to have a government that does everything for the benefit of the people. Now, if you want to dig deeper into that, and I'd rather not go there, that has all sorts of reasons, including the fact that we have members of parliament here that most people feel are not representative of their opinions. And that goes back to the fact that we don't have any political parties where people can go and vote according to ideology as opposed to voting for their cousin or their brother or their tribe or their city. This is going to take a long time for us to get there. But from my side, to answer your question and address it directly, the only way you can incentivize foreign direct investment, the only way you can incentivize local businessmen to start new businesses is through massive tax incentives, especially when the economy is not doing well. I believe that, one, there should be a revisit to the whole taxation system in our country, including the sales tax and what items are subjected to that sales tax. Now we have Joe Biden got elected, and his theme right now, if you look at his president-elect seal, it's Build Back Better. We're not an industrial powerhouse in the region. However, you can promote and incentivize people to buy locally by giving them a huge advantage when it comes to, for instance, items like sales tax. Yeah. All the countries are looking inward right now with the rise of populism around the world, and everyone's trying to protect their own factories and industries and companies. So this is the right time to incentivize people to buy locally, and perhaps giving those local producers huge tax incentives, like, for instance, a moratorium paying incentive corporate taxes, effective tax rate for the next 3 years, is one way of doing it, saying that any item that is locally produced in Jordan and sold in any shop would not have a 16% sales tax on it. It would have something like 4% tax. And in a way, try to let people buy those local products. That way, the local businesses would end up making more money. And the more money they make, at the end of the day, down the line, they'll start paying more taxes. They'll start expanding their operations. They'll start spending capital expenditures. It's an economic cycle. So that would improve the unemployment rate and the purchasing power amongst the population. So For me, I understand the difficulties of being in Jordan with it being a small, limited economy with no natural resources. But at the end of the day, there are things, tangible things that the government can do. And the main tool that they have now is really the taxation portion of it. Now, some may argue that you can't do that because the International Monetary Fund won't let you do that. But there is a window of opportunity because of COVID. All countries around the world are taking extreme measures right now.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't we be able to do the same?
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I agree with the taxation issue. We can't compare ourselves to mature economies like the US, where they can collect tax money and build infrastructure, and that's
They
going to
haven't
be
even
fine.
done that, by the way. It's all a lie. I mean, Trump promised that 4 years ago, and they haven't built a single thing
Well,
when it comes to
obviously.
infrastructure.
Well, yeah. Well, Trump double promises. He promises the corporations to cut corporate income tax and to give tax breaks. At the same time, he promises infrastructure. You can't have both unless you
But it's
print
a
money.
juiced up economy there. I mean, we can. I'm a U.S. Politics buff, by the way, so I am aware of what's been happening in the U.S. in the past few years. But it's even a country like the U.S. with all the promises and all that, they weren't able to improve on their infrastructure. But here, for instance, I think if you have a debt to GDP, we used to think a few months ago, by the way, that we've hit the 100% debt to GDP.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a revision of that. Now it's around 85%. And actually, the right number is 85%, contrary to what we all thought, or even internationally what we had reported. 85%, because if you want to compare our total debt to GDP compared to other countries, it needs to be apples to apples. And we've always included in the higher number, the 100% debt to GDP, we've always included in that debt the debt that the government guarantees to the likes of the Water Authority or the National Electricity Production Company, NEPCO, which is not the right way of doing it. So the number that we have right now, miraculously, is around the 85% figure. And even a country like the US, I think it has hit 110%. Many countries have exceeded that red line, which used to be 60% debt to GDP 10 years ago. Like when the financial crisis happened in the EU and in the US, both of them were below 60% debt to GDP. Now the EU and the US are above 100%. And in Jordan, you need to juice up the economy. We've spoken about taxes, but there is no harm. And actually, there's a huge added advantage to everyone if the government borrows an extra billion or a couple of billion JDs and starts spending it on long-term projects that are needed in Jordan, whether it's fixing highways, whether it's fixing sewer system, whether it's fixing the amount of water that we collect from rain, that I believe 65% of it or so goes down the drain. You can have a government that identifies 3 or 4 long-term projects in infrastructure that they can start spending money on. And when you spend money on those, obviously you can make all sorts of people work, whether it's labor that's going to construct such things, to the suppliers of building materials, to contractors, and to all the ancillary services that come with that. And I think that's something that the government should definitely be looking at.
Let's say they call you up and they say, Fawaz, yalla, let's join minister. You may be Minister of Finance or Minister of one of the big portfolios, and you're able to push around or at least have discussions with His Majesty and with other decision makers in Jordan about these kinds of infrastructure projects. As a newcomer and as fresh blood to the government, would you be a bit skeptical about the efficiency of the expenditure? For example, look at the Rapid Bus project, which is, for Jordan, it's considered a good size project. And mass transit is a segment that's very bad in Jordan. I know as an employer, we have employees all over Amman and suburbs, and it's very costly to move around. And it's not even that big a distance. If you look at that project, for example, which is not complete, I don't think we've seen any part of it even launched, and it's not even on the books for next year. I don't think nobody even expects it to be done anytime soon. It's become a national joke. The same way the airport road, which I think took 8 years to do a 20-mile road, which is something that I think in Dubai would take maybe a couple of months. Would you be skeptical about the ability of the government to really dish out these kind of infrastructure projects and create that kind of growth and ancillary business?
I mean, first of all, I'm from the private sector, so I have a completely different mentality than public domain. To answer your question, I have been asked before to join a couple of places in the public sector, and I've said no because I'm quite happy where I am. I have no ambition or desire to be in public office. But if I had to give my opinion on that, yes, I would be skeptical about expenditures and how they get dispersed and what kind of red tape and bureaucracy that you may run into when working across the government agencies. But at the end of the day, sometimes I think we're a bit too harsh on ourselves, because I tend to be a global reader of how things work sometimes across various countries. I mean, even in the United States, they have red tape and they have bureaucracy, and the government is considered slow in some areas. This whole notion that our ambition should be live in a utopia country where everything goes smoothly is unrealistic. At the end of the day, I agree with what you said about the rapid transit bus and all that, but we've had successes here in Jordan. I mean, look at the airport that we have. It works for what we want. Even what we've done with the King Hussein International Airport in Aqaba, it's decent, and people find it to be adequate for what we have. Look at the new port that we've managed to build in the southern zone of Aqaba. It's also an efficient port that was overseen by the Aqaba Development Corporation, which is a government arm. We've had good successes. Jordan, for all of its size and ability, we have clean cities. Our highways may not be optimal, but we've had them actually developed way before many countries that have a lot of money. So we shouldn't be too harsh on ourselves. But one project that I think, or a couple of projects that I think are very necessary, even if we have to collaborate, and we must collaborate with the private sector and do international tenders for. One is the railway to connect the south with the middle provinces, with the northern provinces, a railway that could cater to both commercial and passengers. I mean, imagine you and I go and visit Aqaba. I have a house there in Talabay, and I usually drive there. It takes 4 hours. Imagine having a train with different compartments, grade A, grade B, grade C, where you can hop on a train here and go straight forward, a fast train using, Japanese technology or even Chinese technology now. And you're in Aqaba, in the middle of Aqaba, in 2 hours. Imagine what that would do to the economy of Aqaba just from internal tourism. Having an infrastructure and a train transit system is, I believe, a very necessary thing to do. We lack the vision here, Imad. I think we know what to do, but for some reason, the collective governments that we have always had different priorities.
What do you think is going to be something in the next couple of years in the private sector that's going to be a good place to invest in, or even to have a startup?
At the risk of expending financial advice here, but if you want my honest opinion, if you have liquidity and you want to make 15 to 20% on your money over the next 12 to 18 months, you just buy the index of the Dow Jones. There is no reason to do anything else. You buy the index, it's diversified. It's at 30,000 now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and I see it hitting the 35,000 by the end of 2021. I've written an article a few years back when the Dow was at 18,000, and I had projected that was going to hit 25,000 within 2 years. It did. And now, if you ask my friends when it hit the 25,000, I told them it's going to hit the 30,000. And now I'm telling you it's going to hit the 35,000 by the end of 2021.
Amazing.
I think there's going to be a huge bounce after the vaccine gets distributed around the world. Yeah. And as things go back to normal, as airlines start to work again, as people start to travel again, some have had huge disruptions that will stay on for some time. Some will struggle, but overall, I think around the globe, and specifically in the US markets, which is the largest, liquid, most investable market in the world, you're going to see that benefit come very quickly. Yeah. Especially with the Trump administration leaving office.
I agree. US stock markets, that they're going to keep growing, if not steadily, but at least in aggregate, they're always going to be heading up. And you have the technology companies that are going to float it, the pharma companies. The fact that the whole world is invested in it, whether you're in China or you're in Russia, everybody's jumping in on it. And even this summer, there were trends that online brokerage firms that are like, like Ameritrade and Schwab, there's like Robinhood now where you can spend pennies. Even if you sign up, they'll give you a free share. Like there's so many people jumping in. Even unemployed millennials are realizing that this is like a guaranteed at least 10% annually if you stay in for a decade or two. It's better than most.
I agree. It's for me, it's the least risky, at least the way I see it.
Yeah. If you had your sights set in Amman, let's say, or in Jordan, would you buy prime real estate? Would you invest in online learning? All this stuff is now, during Corona, there are some bright
My
spots.
best advice has always been in Jordan is to buy real estate.
Yeah, still?
Absolutely. Real estate has gone down by almost 35%. In the past 2 or 3 years, what used to be trading at 100, 3, 4, 5 years ago, now you can probably get it for 60, 65 cents on the dollar.
Yeah.
I've always thought about success in Jordan and who managed to become successful. I deal with many entrepreneurs, I deal with many CEOs and business owners and high net worth individuals. And I always ask myself when I work with these guys, how did this person build that empire and build that wealth? And I discovered 2 facts. One, of all the multimillionaires or the billionaires that we have in Jordan, 95% of them made their money outside of Jordan, didn't make it inside Jordan. That's a fact. The ones in Jordan who didn't go outside and work, but managed to make a lot of money, are the ones who inherited a lot of land.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, wealth accumulation in Jordan, 95% of it can only be done via real estate over the long term. When I say the long term, I'm talking about 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. You buy something now and you keep it.
Yeah.
You keep El Kushan in your drawer. Tonight, try to think of all the famous businessmen that we have without naming names. I will bet you anything. Try to come up with one person that has managed to make a lot of money by just relying on the Jordanian market or starting a business here and not venturing out. Take Noel Group, for instance. Noel, it's a beautiful Jordanian brand. If you dig deep into that group, 90% of their success came from Egypt and Saudi and the UAE. You look at the likes of Sabih al-Masri, Munib al-Masri, Mahmoud Malhas, I can go on and on. All these very successful businessmen, they've all built their wealth outside. The ones inside have all been anchored in real estate, nothing else.
Are there any winners in the COVID economy?
Locally?
Yeah, just locally in Jordan. Any sectors, yeah? Is it like hand sanitizers, toilet paper? I don't know.
Absolutely. The consumer products, they were winners, although this is a sector, with the hygiene and the gels and the masks, this is a high volume, very low margin business. Other than that, I really can't tell you that there were any major winners because, with lockdowns, everything got affected.
Yeah.
You can probably argue that traders of rice and sugar and wheat and what have you, they may have benefited. I don't know. But for instance, I have a client in the poultry sector. You would think that it shouldn't be affected because as people were staying at home, if they're going to choose between red meat and white meat, they're going to choose white meat. So they're going to go for the chicken because it's cheaper. You look at the price per kilo right now and the massive amount of supply out there that's getting frozen and the margin erosion that happened in the sector, they were adversely affected by that.
Yeah, if they rely on restaurants and fast foods, that's all been hurt. There's a bunch of retail banks that operate in Jordan, and they were profitable in 2019. They collectively made, I think it's in the billions if you count all their net profits together. What is it looking like this year from what you've seen so far from the Q1, Q2, Q3?
Minimum 50% hit.
In net profit. So let's say someone like Arab Bank, how many hundreds of millions did they net last year in 2019? Maybe 800?
760, something like that.
Do you think it's fair forget the state shareholders, but for the economy, Jordan, obviously as a capitalist, It's obviously fair for them to make money this year. They're a for-profit business. They're publicly traded. It's their duty to make a profit. But if they come out this year and they say, well, we made 300 million JDs in net profit this year, which is less than half of last year. In the end, some of that is on the backs of people that are going bankrupt, people are getting poor. I'm not talking about general fees for certain transactions. I'm talking about lending and credit card debt and credit card fees and all that kind of stuff. Yes, they took a big hit. They're going to write off a lot of bad debt, even retail-wise, not just corporate. Would it have been better for Jordan, maybe, for the government to tell these big banks in Jordan to be like, okay, this year, guys, you're going to lend and you're not going to make a profit. We're going to try to close out the year even, just to help all the companies.
That's not legal.
It's illegal, I'm sure. But
we're not China.
But the 2% loan, what's the 2% loan that we
it's subsidized.
It's a subsidized.
It's a subsidized.
The bank is making their 8%, yani, while the government is putting.
I don't know the details of what, but there's a cost of money with the repo rate and all that. I'm sure they're not making as much money in terms of spread, but the banks won't let you unless they're making money. They're not a non-profit organization. So government cannot legally tell the private sector lenders how much profit they can make. That's a very bad sign if you have government intervention in that way. Yeah. The only way you can work with them is through the central bank by lowering the deposit rate at the window rate at the central bank, by buying back government bonds that sit on the balance sheet of banks, just like the US did, and giving them extra liquidity. And once they have extra liquidity, there's more competition. When there's more competition, naturally the lending rates would go down. You have to use conventional, traditional methodologies with the monetary and fiscal stimulus that all governments around the world are doing. But under no circumstances should there be an outright government intervention that tells private banks what they can't do in terms of profits. At the end of the day, like you said, there's a fiduciary duty for the board and for the management to maximize shareholder value, and that maximization comes with increasing the profits.
The pain in such an economy in Jordan is that most small businesses are locked in negotiation with their landlords. They're not paying. From the surveys that I've done in my sector, there's a lot of problems with paying rent, with paying employees. The government actually came in and told us, for example, that we're not allowed to let go anyone, which is when you think of a struggling small business, to tell them you can't fire somebody, even if you give them their 2 months, for example, or whatever the severance, you're not allowed to fire somebody. Yet then they can't tell the banks that they need to do a lower rate. So it's kind of.
I agree with you on that front. I mean,
the bank is still the bank's still charging me on my overdraft, making a killing on my overdraft.
They shouldn't have been intervening in the private sector. I mean, they issued Amr al-Difa' Raqam 1, which made it illegal for us as CEOs to lay off workers because they didn't want a spike in unemployment and they didn't want any socio-economic unrest.
Yeah.
Which is understandable. It's a noble cause. But at the end of the day, they thought that the measures that they have taken with delaying the social security payments, delaying the tax payments, postponing the monthly installments on principal and interest with the banks for a few months, for 3 months, I believe, was what was going to put some liquidity back into people's pocket, which it did. But I think the biggest mistake there was the fact that they were operating in a mode where the pandemic's economic effects were not going to last for more than 3 months, because we had a very good numbers at the time, as you remember, in April, May, and June. We had 7 cases one day, and we were all like, "Oh my God, it's too much!" And now we're having thousands of cases, 5,000, 6,000, sometimes 8,000 cases. And but I am with you. What they should have done is doing unemployment insurance. We have a very well-endowed social security fund, and should have played a much stronger and a much more major role in contributing to the salaries of employees. They could have gone to the private sector and told them, listen, if you don't lay off any workers, we'd give you 50% subsidy on the salaries of your employees, for instance. And if you do lay off workers up to a certain percentage, will give you, 25% assistance, and make it an incentivized, a schedule, not to fire people or lower their salaries, or tell them that, you're only going to get 50% or 80% or whatever it is. I think the government made a mistake on that part. And I see, how you're kind of aligning this with their lack of will or inability to go and talk to banks. They thought that they exhausted all options. I think they've done some good things, but they didn't think about the timeline. Right now, for instance, is when we need them to come back again and say, we're going to delay payments on the banks. And no one has been saying anything about that.
My small company, Mlabbas, was one of the first to get approved for a COVID loan. One of literally the first companies, because we started early. We got it in end of April or early May, which means our 6-month grace period actually hit 2 weeks ago. And we spoke to our bank and we made them push our first payment informally on the phone. And they did. We still don't know if next month we're going to have the installment deducted or not. And this is a COVID loan where it's personal guarantee. We obviously borrowed our losses to pay salaries mainly. And thinking of all the hundreds of companies that got this COVID loan, and the economy hasn't come back, depending on your sector, obviously. If you're selling bread, you're going to be fine. If you're selling anything related to the tourism industry, you're in bad shape for the next year. So a lot of companies are going to default, whether it's the government and the banks are going to call the loans, or are they going to just kick the can down the road? It's either way, it's going to be an issue that's going to come up in 2021 in a big way.
Well, at the end of the day, the number of cases and the lack of ability to really go back to normal was really the government's responsibility. They screwed up the whole, COVID response with the way they monitored the external borders and how we jumped into thousands of cases every day. So if I was a decision maker in the government, I would probably refinance all those 2% loans. You've got them for 3 years, right?
6-month grace and then 2-year repayment, monthly repayment.
Yeah, I would probably extend the 6 months grace another 6 months.
Yeah.
And, have it hit in May or June for a company like yours, because at that time, you're going to start seeing light at the end of the tunnel.
Speaking of, and I'm excited to get into some talk about the US. It's one of my favorite topics, as is yours, I'm assuming. It's more interesting, it's more transparent, it's more dynamic. You can really, the data is fascinating from the US, more than any other market on the planet. You can really dig in. And the politics is out in the open, it's understandable. It's pop culture almost, the politics.
Yeah.
It's funny, when I look at the US politics and US economy, I'm less of a Republican, more of a Democrat in terms of spending. I've read enough to know that trickle-down economics, and I look at red states like Kansas, like Missouri, where you have a Republican majority, the legislative body, Congress, and everything, and they just screw it up. They screw it up so bad. They give a lot of big companies big tax cuts. They pay nothing. Rich people don't pay enough taxes, and then where do they cut? They cut public school education. They cut healthcare, and the results are not very good. But when you look at somewhere like California, which is the other end of the spectrum, California is obviously a land of milk and honey for tech, for a lot of businesses, but it's also a nightmare in terms of regulation, in terms of taxes. It is another nightmare on the other side of the spectrum. So somewhere, I'm not saying that somewhere in the middle is good. I believe like Canadian style healthcare, the single payer, it saves the government so much money. So if you're
pro Bernie Sanders, just admit it, Imad.
Basically, I'm pro Bernie, definitely. Just
when it comes to healthcare.
When it comes to healthcare, the only reason to maintain the lack of single payer is to rescue the giant health insurance industry that are basically a middleman. The argument I get from people who are scared of public healthcare, they always say, you want me to stand in line for a hip replacement? Do you want me to stand in line for this? Do you want me to wait for this? And my answer always is, dude, if you're a rich guy in Canada or London,
you're not going to stand in line.
You're not standing in any line, my friend. There is private healthcare in every rich country in the world.
You go to Harley Street and you get into operation the next day.
Exactly. So don't give me that stuff. It's for people who really need it, and sometimes
it's people who cannot afford it. I know when it comes to American politics, at least on social issues, I'm a Democrat.
Yani, rights like gay rights and stuff like that, or which social issues are we talking about?
Across the board, when
Abortion.
it comes to, I am pro-choice, anti-gun.
Yeah.
I am pro-LGBTQ rights at the expense of saying it in a Middle Eastern forum like yours, but live and let live. I am more of an Obama Democrat. I'm a centrist Democrat. I'm not a far left Antifa,
Yeah.
I'm really an Obama Democrat. I'm probably a Joe Biden Democrat. I do believe in having a single payer program. Bernie Sanders made huge sense to me. And there's no reason why tens of millions of Americans are without healthcare, or if they lose their job, they don't have anything to fall back on. I do believe that healthcare is a right. It is not a privilege.
Can you imagine being stuck at a shitty job because you're afraid of switching healthcare and having that gap? That's not a healthy economic situation for the country, even.
Or social. Sometimes I go to C-SPAN and I watch all these hearings with the CEOs of pharma companies, for instance, being questioned by members of Congress. And there was a question about a drug that was being sold for $1,800 per month for the transmission of AIDS and HIV. It gets sold for $1,800 a month because of the patent that's still outstanding in the United States. The same drug gets sold for $8 in Australia. Imagine the gap.
Imagine.
When you want to be the number one superpower in the world and you have tens of millions of your population without health insurance, I think it's just a sham.
Yeah.
That's just capitalism at its most raw. So that's why I'm more Democrat leaning. I'm not for trickle-down economics or Reaganomics or, what happened in the 80s with the trickle-down economics and all that. But believe it or not, if you look at the history of GDP growth or even balancing the budget, Democratic administrations fare much better than Republican ones.
True.
Even though the Republicans are supposed to be the ones for small government, low spending, no welfare programs, no food stamps, no this, no that, but every time the Republicans come in, they start a war that costs $1 trillion, and then they talk about being fiscally conservative. It just doesn't make sense.
No, you're right. Since Reagan, it's also been tax cuts that have caused the deficit. Yeah.
I'm more impressed with the way democracy works in the United Kingdom than I am with the two-party system of the United States. Like, for instance, the US president gets elected by the electoral college, doesn't get elected by the popular vote, which doesn't make sense to me. It's an outdated system. So I think that's disproportionately allows for, the white, smaller rural states to have more of an influence. And I think they've calculated that influence, they have it more by 7 or 8%.
To a Californian, for example,
exactly
10x.
So that's when I'm not impressed by that. The US president comes in, even if he gets elected by a landslide, if his party loses the Senate, that is likely to happen now with the Georgia votes in January, you can technically have a government in gridlock where none of his programs gets implemented, even though he has the majority in the House of Representatives and he has the White House. Yeah. While in the UK, for instance, you have proportional representation. Multiple parties as opposed to just Republicans and Democrats. You have the Liberal Democrats, you have the Tories, you have Labour, you have the Brexit Party or the UKIP, or you have the Scottish National Party. There are multiple parties that represent different schools of thought and ideologies. And all ministers have to be elected members of parliament, as opposed to the president who comes in and appoints a non-elected Secretary of State, a non-elected Secretary of Commerce, a non-elected this, and non-elected that. It's more of a representative democracy in the United Kingdom.
That's true. The funny thing is, if you look at the two-party system in the US and why there isn't a third party, you can kind of draw a parallel. The two only parties in the US that matter won't be able to allow for a third party because they won't know where the ball's going to land. Are they going to lose the most constituents to the third party? Are they going to be a kingmaker? What kind of coalition can they form? They don't know. It's an unknown, and every year could be different. So they won't allow for that to happen because it's not in their interest, neither of the two parties. The infrastructure behind the Democrats and the Republicans, from institutions and think tanks and lobby groups, they're just so invested in these two groups. It's not impressive at all. And it's funny. The sad thing is actually about having just two parties in the US. Like someone like me, if I was in the US, For example, I'm for the market solving problems. For example, I don't mind that there's Uber and this kind of gig economy that's popping up that's hurting different sectors. It's part of capitalism. It's I think
evolution.
Yeah, but for me, healthcare, the market can't solve for a pre-existing condition. If you're born with an issue like your child, let's say you're a poor dad and you have a child that has an existing condition, the market cannot solve for that. There's no profit to be made off of that. Khalas, give that to the public sector. The same way
I
you do
agree.
public school. 12th graders in the US, you can go to an excellent public school in the US. It's public. It's a public sector. The community pays
It
for it
depends
with
on the
tax.
neighborhood also, come on.
Of course, yes. Suddenly you draw a line. When you go to college, college is not free. So who drew that line? Why is it from high school to college? So like someone like Bernie Sanders is saying, let's redraw that line. Let's make it 4 years of college or 2 years of college. Let the county pay for it. Yes, Amazon is going to pay more in taxes. Yes, other companies are going to pay more in taxes. So what?
Actually, they don't pay much taxes.
They don't pay much taxes anyway. Exactly. I mean, they should be.
They re-domiciled into places like Ireland, and I mean, they've used all sorts of tax loopholes. It's a very fascinating country, the United States. I mean, it's an experiment, right? I mean, it's only been there for 240 years. It's the only country that encompasses all races, all religions, all ethnicities. Naturally, you're going to have issues because of the diversity of cultures and different schools of thought. I was happy to see a reversal from the whole America First policy, because I think the world needs them to continue to be multilateral and continue to lead, continue to respect at least, human rights around the world, as opposed to authoritarian regimes. Various leaders, they had a joyride with this administration. Dictators in Hungary, in Russia, in Poland, in Philippines, and in Brazil. They had their leader inside the White House, and if he was doing something, they could model it after him and say, well, he's doing it. So
Yeah.
I'm reading Obama's new book, by the way, which I highly recommend to your listeners and to you, Imad. It's a 900-page book.
Wow.
It's called The Promised Land, and that's only volume 1. That's his own, the first 4 years of his term. But it's really a fascinating book, beautifully written, by the way.
I'm excited to actually. I listened to his first book, Dreams from My Father. I have it on audio, and I listened to it more than once. And he narrated that one with his own voice.
There's an audio one for this one, A Promised Land, too, by the way.
And he's the one narrating it?
He's the one narrating it,
Okay, that makes it even more of a pleasure.
More appealing.
I'm an audiobook junkie, so I haven't been able to read a book cover to cover in many years without falling asleep and giving up. So audiobook is my...
I do fall asleep whenever I read, and it's a good way to go to sleep. But
it is better than screens.
It's my hobby.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Now we have something else in common, Fawaz. We actually both did the Tony Robbins Unleash the Power Within.
Yeah.
We've been to that crazy seminar. I went in 2018, but you went much earlier than that. What year
I went
did you go?
in 2011 or 2012. I don't recall. I went to Los Angeles with my partner at the time. Believe it or not, Oprah was attending with us at the same time. So we walked on fire, and he stirred up all sorts of things in us. Fascinating guy. I came across him actually when I was a freshman at Tufts in Boston in 1990 from his infomercials. And since that time, I've read his books. One of the best books he's written was Awaken the Giant Within. And I've bought his CDs and tapes.
I would say definitely it's a changing point in my life happened during that experience.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Believe it or not, when I started my business, Imad, he was one of the main reasons for that.
Wow.
Because I had been listening to his tapes. I got a lot of psychological encouragement from that. Yasmin always teases me about my fascination with him. When I came back from the seminar, she was like, you've changed and all that. I mean, obviously things, after you come back, they stay with you, but then it's one of those things where you have to really rejuvenate every couple of years. You have to remind yourself of what he taught you in those seminars.
To
stay fresh.
Definitely. And I've adopted a couple of cool rituals, daily rituals that keep you bouncing back from crazy stuff that happens during the week, the daily grind of work and family. anything in your routine that you can attribute to him, or not even to him, just in general, some things that keep you on the edge of performance?
One thing that lasted with me till now, I always drink my water with lemon because, he always said that maintains an alkaline environment. So that's on the health side. He also taught me how to breathe if I'm stressed, the right way to breathe and relax and get rid of a headache and all that. That all kind of, stayed with me.
Nice.
On the other part, professionally, I think the main mantra that kind of stuck is one thing that he said and he wrote in some of his books. And it's a saying that says, if you can't, then you must. And if you must, then you can. Always, if you believe that you can't do something, that means that you must try to do it. And if you must do it, then you can do it. And that kind of, stuck with me, along with other various teachings about, for instance, it's very hard to be depressed or down if you put a smile on your face. I mean, imagine now, put a smile on your face. It's impossible to feel down. So it's little tricks like that here and there. He's obviously someone who's done a lot of research on peak performance. He's one of those people where you really, every year, you have to kind of not necessarily go to a seminar, but you have to really have a set of notes that you can go back to.
He is a force of nature, and there's so many hacks that you can pick up from him. I've actually recruited people to go just from talking about it.
My next goal is to go and attend his business mastery 7-day thing. I also promised Yasmin, my wife, to take her and do the UPW at some point.
Yeah.
We were planning on doing it until the COVID thing hit.
Yeah, once it comes back offline. Wallah,
maybe we'll go together with you and Jenna.
Wallah, I'd love to. I really want to go. Honestly, if they're doing it again in public and there's no corona scare, we will go because we don't. I predict that he's not going back to live anymore after this. I think he's having so much success with the virtual. Might actually not happen.
It takes a big toll on him. I don't think he's going to be doing it for much longer.
His voice is gone. Yeah, listen, Anna, my wife and I went last December to the next level one, the 6-day one, Date with Destiny. There's a Netflix documentary about that one. It's a bit more intense and his voice is gone, but they've managed to insert his previous videos in a very big immersive way in the right places. So you really feel like you're getting the same thing. But the UPW...
He's definitely one of those people that I'd like to have a coffee with or have a meal with at some point.
Yeah.
If every one of us has 1, 2, or 3 people they want to dine with at some point. I have 3. I have him, Barack Obama, and Monica Bellucci.
Monica Bellucci, man. Maybe too late for that. I don't know how old she is now, but yeah.
She's 62, I think.
Yeah, wallah, you're keeping tabs. Good.
Yeah, absolutely.
But wallah, Tony Robbins, you can pay for the Fiji trip and go.
That's too far, man. Fiji is way too far.
Man, Fawaz, thanks so much for this
talk. Thank you, Imad. Thank you. And it was a pleasure being on your podcast. I wish you very well in Saudi Arabia. And I hope we can do this sometime in the near future.
Thanks, buddy. Definitely. It was amazing.